Hello, U.S. history students. This is our sixth week of online classes. So that means we were out a week before that. So we've been out of school now for 7 weeks. I'd like you guys to check your grade book to make sure you have everything in. If you don't have it in, just a reminder, make sure we get it in. And if you know you handed it in or sent it in, did the form, but it's still, there's not a grade on it, let me know and I'll check. We want to make sure that we get everything in that we need to, and everybody seems to be doing real well, but there's some things that need to be handed in. First thing we're going to be doing is watching this week 6 video that I'm doing right now that you're watching. And the next thing is we're going to be doing the Vietnam War. Now we're going to be dividing this into 2 parts. We really only have about 2 to 3 weeks left of school, including this week that we're on. But the Vietnam War went from 1954 to 1975. And we're just going to quickly go through a little bit of this. Before, you have to realize that France controlled Indochina, which is Vietnam for the most part in that area, since the late 19th century. And then Japan is going to take control during World War II, just because they were expanding throughout the Pacific, and that's one area in which they expanded. Eventually, the French are going to recolonize, or at least attempt to, but there's going to be an issue where the Vietnamese people in this area are not going to want others involved. They don't want to be a colony. Eventually, the French are going to lose control and to Ho Chi Minh, and they're going to lose control. And President Eisenhower is going to decline to intervene on the French behalf. But eventually, we're going to just gradually get ourselves involved. The International Conference at Geneva, Vietnam is divided in the 17th parallel. So in other words, it's going to be divided into North and South. Ho Chi Minh nationalist forces controlled the North, but you have to realize during this period of time, they didn't want just the North. They thought it should be a united Vietnam. And Diem, a French-educated Roman Catholic, which was a Westerner pretty much, grew up for the most part in Western schools, claimed control of the South. And he believed in a democratic government, supposedly, and then Ho Chi Minh was a communist. There was a date set for a democratic election to reunify Vietnam, but the weird thing is Diem, who is the leader of the South, is going to back out of the elections. And there's going to be a conflict between the North and South Vietnam during this period of time. Eventually, the French are going to leave, and as the French are leaving, we are going to get sucked into Vietnam. You have to realize, you would think that the South would be very happy because Diem was supposedly a democratic leader, but that's not the way it was. Diem's family, and that's the leader of the South, held all the power, had all the wealth. People were very upset. Many people were being persecuted, including the Buddhists, and they were going to be tortured and persecuted and not have any political or religious freedom. But at this time, the United States still backed Diem's government because obviously they didn't want the communists involved. They were afraid if the communists took control of Vietnam, it would be a domino effect. And we'll get to this a little bit more. So in other words, many countries would fall to communism, and then we'd end up having half the countries as communists and half as democracy, and that would threaten our existence as well. President Eisenhower is going to send financial and military aid, and 675 U.S. Army advisors were sent by 1960. So in other words, 675 people were supposedly not going to be involved in the fighting, but just help them with their decision making. Early on, there's going to be protests of Diem's government, and as you notice, Buddhist monks were being persecuted, so they ended up, or at least this one ended up setting himself on fire to make a point as far as how they were being treated and how Diem's government was not the way to go in the future. By 1960, Kennedy's going to be elected, and he's going to increase these military advisors, which really weren't supposed to be fighting, to 16,000. In 1963, JFK supported a Vietnamese military coup d'etat, which just means a military takeover. Diem and his brothers are going to be murdered. And then shortly afterwards, Kennedy will be assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas on November 22nd. Remembering Truman's loss of China after Korea, obviously, Johnson, who's the new president during this period of time, wanted ground forces sent in because he believed in the domino theory. In other words, if Vietnam went communism, many other countries would fall. And what Johnson stated is, I'm not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way of China. Advised to rout the communists by Secretary of Defense Robert C. McNamara, the Tonkin Gulf incident took place in 1964. According to Johnson, the attacks were unprovoked on American ships. So what they're going to do is they're going to use this as a reason to have the Tonkin Gulf resolution. So in other words, it gave the military pretty much a blank check to go on the aggressive against the North Vietnamese. So now they didn't have to wait to be attacked. Now we could be on the aggressive. We're going to send more soldiers in. We're going to go all out in favor of the South against the North Vietnamese. And there's little video clips along here. And as you can see here, 1961, very few soldiers. By 1968, there were over 500,000. So we would be very deep into it, even by 1966. The ground war, 1965 to 68, there was really no territorial goals. They pretty much wanted to keep these just South Vietnam. But it was the first time that television got involved in a war. So in other words, people could watch the Vietnam War, and at least from news perspective, in their living room when they're watching the nightly news. So obviously, and there was also a body count going on TV every night, so people could see the horrors of war. The Viet Cong supplies over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So in other words, they ended up having a trail for supplies and men that would end up supplying the North and South, the North, whether they were in the South or the North. And again, it would be very difficult to defeat the North Vietnamese just because they would look like soldiers, they'd be fighting and everything else, they would disappear and they would turn into farmers. And that's what's going to be coming up here in just a little bit. Well, you have to realize a lot of the Ho Chi Minh Trail was going to not even be in Vietnam. So the United States wasn't supposed to be fighting outside of Vietnam. So it made it very easy for the North Vietnamese supply and men and everything to go on this trail because the United States and other forces weren't allowed to attack in these areas that were outside of Vietnam. But in 1965, sustained bombing of North Korea, and that was called Operation Rolling Thunder. If you look at this, the B-52 bombers on March 2nd, 1965, started bombing and pretty much did carpet bombing in large areas. In 1966 to 68, ongoing bombing of Hanoi, nonstop for 3 years, and targeted the Ho Chi Minh Trail as well. And obviously, during this period of time, some pilots are going to be shot down, and one of them is going to be John McCain, who ended up running for president just a few years ago, and he just died recently. So again, they did carpet bombing, and they would also try to get rid of all the jungle, so they would end up dropping, whether it's bombs and spray, to try to kill the jungle so they could be able to find the enemy. The Viet Cong, just like I said just a little bit ago, they were farmers by day and guerrillas at night. So it was very, very difficult to defeat them. It was hard to tell the difference between friend and enemy. It was hard to tell the difference between North and South. They were very patient people, willing to accept many casualties. And the U.S. grossly underestimated their resolve because they were fighting for their homeland. So they could wait it out. And it said guerrilla wins if he does not lose. A conventional army loses if he does not win. So in other words, if the United States didn't win quickly, eventually public opinion would turn on them. So all the North had to do and the Viet Cong had to do was wait it out. And eventually public opinion, which it did, turned on the idea of being in Vietnam. Just like it says, who was the enemy? It was very difficult to tell. General Westmoreland, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. So not only were there issues, but also people were saying, the military leaders were saying, you know what, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but then we were losing battles. And it was shown on the nightly news that this was taking place. It was very hard for the American people to believe what they were being told. And one of the things that's going to happen is the Tet Offensive. And the Tet Offensive was the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong are going to attack the South. And what they're going to do is they're going to end up having 67,000 people attack 100 cities, bases, and U.S. Embassy in Saigon all at one time. Well, all of a sudden, in the nightly news, people are going to see this and they're going to be like, oh my goodness, we're being overrun. There's no way we're going to win this war. So they're going to take every major southern city. It won't be long before the Americans are going and the South Vietnamese are going to be able to beat back that offensive, and the North Vietnamese army is going to be debilitated. But it's seen by the American people as a defeat because what they were watching on TV. And again, this is a Tet Offensive. You have North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and you can see all these red where there were attacks simultaneously. Again, it didn't take long for the Americans to push back the North Vietnamese, but it was still a loss in the Americans' way of thinking and what they saw. The impact of the Tet Offensive, well, domestically in the U.S., reaction was disbelief. They couldn't believe this could happen to the Americans. They were angry. They thought they were being lied to. They didn't trust the Johnson administration anymore. And one of the slogans during this period of time was, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? So again, the American people turned on the war in a hurry. And here's just a little poster of it. And that's where we're going to end as far as the notes for this week. Also, you're going to have a few pages to read all about the Vietnam War. And then after that, we need you to fill out the form on the Vietnam War. Okay, there's just a few questions, and I'll ask you a few of them. We went over a few of them. Some of it will be in your reading. Go ahead and answer those questions. And then we have a short film about explain in 25 minutes about the Vietnam War. And then the last thing is there's just some important facts I want you to be able to comprehend. So end up filling this form up and sending it, and that will be the end of week 6. Hey, thanks so much. I appreciate it, everything you guys are doing. And if you have any questions, please get a hold of me. Thank you.